In the aftermath of the Civil War, America stood at a crossroads. The nation had been torn apart, and though the chains of slavery had been broken, the path toward true freedom for millions of newly emancipated people was far from clear. For a brief moment during Reconstruction, hope flickered. Freed men and women built schools, ran for office, and began to shape a vision of a new South, one where justice might finally reach beyond race. But as the years passed, that hope began to dim. Many in the South resisted change, fearful of losing the power and privilege they had long held. Slowly, a new system began to emerge, one that sought to control rather than to unite, to divide rather than to heal. It came to be known as Jim Crow. Under this system, laws were crafted to keep communities apart. Though the words on paper spoke of separation, the true intent was far deeper. It created two worlds, one with access to opportunity, and another burdened by barriers. Public schools, transportation, restaurants, and even water fountains were split along racial lines. This was not only about where people could go, but about what they were allowed to dream. In towns across the South, signs hung over doorways and train platforms, marking spaces as "for whites" or "for colored." What had once been open streets became symbols of exclusion. The system was upheld not only by laws but also by the silent weight of fear, a fear that discouraged speaking out, that punished defiance, and that turned equality into a distant ideal. Yet, even in the midst of injustice, courage endured. Families held on to their dignity, educators built schools in church basements, and communities rose together in quiet defiance. They sang, they learned, and they taught their children to believe in a better tomorrow. The story of life under Jim Crow is not just about oppression, it's about resilience, faith, and the unyielding human spirit that refused to be broken. If you find this story meaningful and want to learn more about the history that shaped America, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that uncover the truth behind the past. In the years following the rise of the Jim Crow system, a quiet yet powerful division took root across the American South. It was a separation that reached into every corner of daily life, shaping where people could sit, study, eat, and even walk. It wasn't just a matter of rules written into law, it was a system designed to remind an entire community that they were seen as lesser, every single day. Imagine a young child waking before sunrise, clutching a worn book as they walk miles to a small wooden schoolhouse. The walls are cracked, the roof leaks when it rains, and the desks are secondhand, passed down from another school across town. That other school, larger and brightly painted, sits just beyond reach. It has new textbooks, sturdy desks, and a library full of stories that many children will never get to read. The difference between the two isn't just material, it speaks to how one group was expected to learn within limits, while another was encouraged to dream without them. The same pattern extended to every aspect of public life. On city buses, certain rows were reserved, and everyone knew the unwritten rules. A person could pay the same fare as anyone else, yet still be told where to sit, or when to move. At train stations, separate waiting rooms carried the same air of quiet and justice, the comfort of one space starkly contrasted with the wear of the other. Even the simplest acts, getting a drink of water, buying a meal, or watching a movie, were shaped by invisible lines that could not be crossed. Signs hung above fountains and doorways, dividing everyday experiences into categories that spoke volumes about power and belonging. In restaurants, one side might gleam with polished counters and bright lights, while the other remained tucked away, dimly lit, and bare. For those living under this system, it was not just physical separation, it was a constant reminder that the promise of equality remained out of reach. Public parks, libraries, and theaters followed the same rhythm. In some towns, families were forbidden from entering certain playgrounds or swimming pools. In others, the rules went unspoken, yet everyone knew them. Segregation was maintained not only through the law, but through the weight of expectation, through glances, silence, and the quiet reinforcement of who belonged where. But beneath the shadow of inequality, there was strength. In neighborhoods that the law sought to keep divided, communities grew resilient. Churches became meeting places, not just for worship, but for learning and organizing. Teachers, often underpaid and overworked, poured their energy into giving children the tools to imagine something greater. Families built networks of care, helping one another survive a system that seemed designed to break them down. Life under segregation was not defined solely by deprivation, but also by endurance. Every barrier that existed was met with determination, the belief that one day, those barriers would fall. People found ways to celebrate joy, to create art, music, and literature that spoke of both pain and pride. They carried forward the idea that humanity could not be divided by signs or walls, that dignity was something no law could erase. Through decades of inequality, that spirit endured, in classrooms, on buses, and in the hearts of those who refused to give up. It became the quiet foundation for a movement that would later shake the nation and challenge the very core of the system that sought to silence them. After the promise of Reconstruction faded, a new struggle emerged, one that was less visible than chains, yet just as powerful. Across the South, the right to vote, the very symbol of citizenship, became a distant dream for many. On paper, the Constitution granted freedom and equality. In reality, a web of obstacles was carefully built to ensure that some voices would never be heard. It began quietly, through laws that seemed ordinary, even harmless at first glance. Local officials introduced taxes for those wishing to vote, small sums for some, but impossible for others who labored from sunrise to sunset just to feed their families. The poll tax, as it was called, turned democracy into something that could be bought, placing the ballot box behind a wall of poverty. Then came the literacy tests, written not to measure knowledge, but to confuse and exclude. In some counties, a man might be asked to recite a section of the state constitution by heart, or interpret a complex legal clause without error. Others were handed sheets filled with trick questions, their answers judged by officials who already knew what verdict they would give. It was not about ability, it was about control. Those who passed were often chosen beforehand, and those who failed were left standing outside, their right denied with a simple shake of the head. But laws alone were not enough to silence an entire people. Fear did the rest. In many towns, the mere act of registering to vote could bring threats, job loss, or worse. Local sheriffs looked the other way when intimidation occurred, and sometimes took part in it themselves. Families whispered of neighbors who disappeared after trying to cast their ballots, their courage remembered in silence. To challenge the system was to risk everything, yet some still did. Despite the danger, communities continued to gather in secret, teaching one another how to read, how to fill out forms, how to stand firm. Churches became safe havens where people shared information about upcoming elections and planned strategies to resist unfair laws. Each vote cast became an act of defiance, a declaration that citizenship could not be taken by force or deceit. The system that blocked the ballot was more than a political tool, it was a way to shape society itself. By denying a voice, those in power controlled who built the roads, who taught the children, and who wrote the future. Generations grew up under a government that did not represent them, a government that spoke in their name while silencing their truth. Yet, even in the darkest moments, determination endured. Traveling educators went from town to town, helping people prepare for the impossible tests. Some citizens hid their registration cards as if they were precious heirlooms. Every effort, no matter how small, became a step toward reclaiming a stolen right. It would take decades of courage, protest, and sacrifice before the nation began to face the injustice at its core. The struggle for the vote was not just about marking a ballot, it was about dignity, recognition, and the belief that every voice mattered. Through all the barriers, through fear and loss, the will to be heard never died. It was passed down like a flame, carried from one generation to the next, until the light could no longer be ignored. There was a time in America when fear itself was used as a weapon. It lingered in the air of small towns and rural crossroads, in places where the law did not always protect but sometimes looked the other way. The years after Reconstruction were marked not just by laws of separation, but by acts meant to send a message, that those who dared to challenge the order of things would pay a price. In the stillness of night, rumors would travel faster than the wind. A name whispered, a knock at the door, the sound of footsteps fading into darkness. Communities learned to live with uncertainty, never knowing when anger or accusation might turn deadly. Newspapers spoke of mob justice, but for those who lived under its shadow, there was nothing just about it. This violence was not random. It was deliberate, meant to keep people silent, to make them afraid of even the thought of equality. In many towns, entire communities would wake to find the aftermath of a night's terror, a warning left behind for all to see. Those moments were designed to break the spirit of a people, to remind them that their lives could be controlled through fear alone. But even as fear spread, so did courage. Families comforted one another in secret, churches became places of refuge, and voices began to rise, quietly at first, then stronger with time. Writers, preachers, and activists started to speak out, documenting what others tried to hide. They believed that truth, once revealed, could weaken even the most powerful lies. What emerged from this darkness was not only pain, but resilience, the determination of a community that refused to surrender its humanity. They endured, they built, and they carried their stories forward, ensuring that the world would one day remember what they had faced. This chapter of history is not easy to confront, but it is one that must be told. It reminds us how far humanity can fall, and how deeply courage can rise. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more untold histories that reveal the strength of the human spirit. When the Civil War ended, freedom came with a promise, the chance to work, to earn, and to build a life with dignity. For many families, that promise glimmered like a distant horizon, bright and full of hope. Yet, as the years passed, they found that the freedom they had gained in name was not the same as the freedom they lived in reality. Across the South, vast plantations still stretched to the horizon, and the land remained in the hands of a few. For those who had once labored there, the only work available was often on the very same fields, under new agreements that seemed fair on paper but cruel in practice. It was called sharecropping, a system that promised independence but delivered little more than a different kind of bondage. Under this arrangement, a farmer would rent a small piece of land from its owner, paying with a portion of the crops he grew. At first, it seemed like a chance to start anew, to work one's own soil, to decide what to plant, and to keep what was earned. But at harvest time, the truth revealed itself. The debts owed for tools, seed, and rent always seemed to outweigh the profits. Year after year, families found themselves deeper in debt, tied not by chains, but by contracts and credit books written in someone else's hand. Children joined their parents in the fields from dawn until dusk. Education was a luxury that many could not afford, and the seasons dictated every part of life, planting, tending, and harvesting. The rhythm of work never ended, and the dream of ownership drifted further away with each passing year. For those who sought jobs outside the fields, the opportunities were little better. Factories, railroads, and mills often paid far less to workers of color, regardless of skill or effort. Promotions were rare, and discrimination shaped every wage slip. Many took whatever work they could find, domestic service, manual labor, or construction, their pay barely enough to cover food and shelter. Yet within this hardship, something remarkable endured, a quiet strength. Families shared what little they had, building communities of mutual support. Churches became centers of hope, where people sang songs of faith and endurance. Skilled workers passed down their crafts, carpentry, masonry, tailoring, to the next generation, keeping alive the idea that hard work could still mean something greater than survival. Every harvest season, despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of pride in what could not be taken away, the love within families, the stories told by firelight, the belief that someday the soil might yield not just crops, but freedom itself. The system of low wages and unfair labor contracts was designed to keep people in place, to maintain the same hierarchy that had existed before emancipation. But even in those fields, seeds of resistance were sown. Education became a quiet rebellion, saving a few coins each month was an act of defiance. The will to own a piece of land, however small, became a dream passed down through generations. The story of labor during this time is not just one of poverty, it is one of perseverance. Against the weight of injustice, countless men and women worked not only to survive, but to lay the foundation for those who would one day break free from the limits placed upon them. Their sweat and sacrifice built the groundwork for progress, one furrowed field at a time. In the midst of hardship and injustice, a quiet strength began to take root. Across the South, where laws sought to divide and silence, people found ways to build unity and hope. Though denied equality in public life, they created spaces of their own, places where voices could rise freely, where dignity could not be taken, and where the seeds of change were carefully sown. The foundation of these communities often began with a single gathering. In a small wooden church, under the glow of oil lamps, families would come together after long days of work. These churches were more than places of worship, they were centers of life, education, and resistance. Within their walls, people planned, taught, and inspired one another. Hymns carried not only faith but also determination, reminding everyone that their struggle was shared and their worth unshaken. Schools soon followed. Teachers, many of whom had little themselves, dedicated their lives to opening the minds of children who had been told they were not meant to learn. Books were scarce, classrooms were humble, yet the pursuit of knowledge became a quiet form of defiance. To read, to write, to understand history, these acts were revolutionary in their own way. Education was more than a path to opportunity, it was a declaration of self-worth. Beyond the churches and schools, entire communities worked together to build systems of support that the wider society denied them. Small businesses emerged, barbershops, grocery stores, and newspapers that celebrated local achievements and told stories ignored elsewhere. These businesses became symbols of self-reliance and pride, showing that even within barriers, progress was possible. Out of this resilience grew a new generation of leaders. Ministers, teachers, and activists began to organize, creating networks that would later evolve into national movements. Groups formed to challenge unfair laws, to speak out against violence, and to demand the simple but powerful promise of equality. They wrote petitions, staged peaceful protests, and traveled from town to town, spreading the message that justice could not be silenced forever. Through faith and perseverance, these communities built something extraordinary, a culture of unity that no law could undo. Music, storytelling, and tradition became tools of endurance, connecting generations through shared memory and hope. Spirituals sung in church pews carried messages of freedom, community gatherings transformed grief into strength. Even in the face of danger, people found ways to protect and uplift one another. When threats came, neighbors stood watch. When someone fell, others stepped forward. The spirit of collective care became a shield against despair. Every sermon preached, every classroom lesson taught, and every song sung was a small act of resistance, a reminder that humanity could not be divided by injustice. By the early 20th century, these networks of faith and determination began to reach beyond their local roots. They became the backbone of a growing movement that would eventually challenge the very laws that had tried to suppress them. What began as humble gatherings in small towns would later echo through marches, speeches, and moments that changed the nation. The story of these communities is not one of defeat, but of triumph born from endurance. They built with what little they had, and from that, they created the foundation for freedom's next chapter, proving that even in the harshest times, hope, when shared, can become a force stronger than fear. As the 20th century unfolded, winds of change began to stir. Voices that had once been silenced rose together, echoing through streets, churches, and classrooms. Marches filled the roads where silence had reigned for too long, and the laws that had divided people for generations finally began to crumble. One by one, the walls of Jim Crow were torn down through courage, unity, and the unyielding belief that freedom must belong to all. But while the laws changed, the echoes of that system never fully disappeared. The end of segregation did not erase the scars it left behind. Generations who had been denied education, land, and fair opportunity continued to struggle beneath the weight of inequality that had been carefully built over decades. The neighborhoods that had once been restricted by invisible lines remained unequal in schools, housing, and income. The cycle of disadvantage, rooted in history, proved harder to break than any written law. Even today, traces of that past can be seen, not as open signs or written rules, but in the quiet spaces where opportunity is not the same for everyone. It lingers in the wealth gap between families, in the schools that lack resources, and in the subtle ways society still struggles to see everyone with equal worth. The shadows of Jim Crow may have faded, but they have not vanished. They live on in the systems and attitudes shaped by generations of separation and struggle. Yet, there is another legacy, one born not from the oppression itself, but from the resilience that resisted it. The strength of those who endured and fought for justice still lights the path forward. Each act of kindness, every movement for equality, every effort to learn and to listen continues the work that began long ago. History's pain, when remembered, becomes a teacher. It reminds us that progress requires not only laws, but understanding, empathy, and courage. The story of Jim Crow is not only about what was lost, it is also about what survived, the faith, the unity, and the unbroken will of a people who refused to surrender their humanity. From the darkness of the past came a vision of a fairer tomorrow, carried by those who believed that change, though slow, was always possible. As we reflect on that history, may we remember its lessons and continue the journey toward a more just and compassionate world. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. Thank you for watching, and have a peaceful night.